let's say that only 49% of people who ever exist are saved. Do you think that would be a theological problem? Do you think that somehow in the future that it'll come out in the end where most people are saved?
All right, I found this interesting video on a gentleman by the name of Frank, um, as he tries to defend on why God allows evil. And I always like to see other people's perspective on their type of answers regarding this question because I know it's a very, you know, um, hot topic when it comes to non-believers on I can't trust your God or I can't believe in your God because he allows evil to happen. So I kind of want to see his perspective on this. So let's go ahead and tackle that video.
That it appears in your If God, Why Evil lectures,
Uh-huh.
you justify the existence of suffering with a sort of utilitarian explanation by saying that the allowance of suffering leads to a higher good. But my question is that it doesn't seem like the good in the world outweighs the suffering, that it seems like it becomes worth it in the end. Because most people who've ever existed and will ever exist are destined for hell.
First of all, how do we know that?
I guess we don't.
That would be the question. Okay, how do we know that? And then secondly, how do we know that evil that occurs in this world doesn't have good effects later in this world and even into eternity? There's no way we could know that it didn't have those effects because of the ripple effect. For those of you that were up north last night, we went through this talking about the ripple effect, right? That every event ripples forward to affect trillions of other events. And for example, I mean, just think about the ripple effects in your own life. You wouldn't be sitting here today if your parents didn't meet, and their parents didn't meet, and their parents didn't meet, right? All those ripples, just people meeting and having children, allowed us to be here today. We can't trace all those ripples, but a being outside of time and space can. So we can't say that because something evil occurs today has no ultimate good in it. There's no way of knowing whether it has good or not in it. You've just got to, you don't have the knowledge to know that. Does that make sense?
Yes. So
Okay.
let's say that only 49% of people who ever exist are saved. Do you think that would be a theological problem? Do you think that somehow in the future that it'll come out in the end where most people are saved? Because I'm saying that it seems weird. It seems like God shouldn't have created the world if most people who ever exist are destined for hell.
Why? Because what you're assuming there is a moral standard judging what God does, right? Here's something that God can't do. He can't force free creatures to do what he wants, because if he does that, they're not free, right? If he makes them robots, then they're not loving. So in order for us to have true love and true moral choice, he has to give us free will. And if he gives us free will, it might be that even a majority of people freely decide not to accept the redemption that Christ has provided. Is God obligated not to create at all because more people reject him than accept him?
Well, with utilitarianism, as far as I understand it, it's about weighing the good and the bad. So if more people go to hell, then under that ethical system, wouldn't it be considered
Well, God's
bad?
not a utilitarian. God can bring... Utilitarian is do whatever is the most good for the most people, right? Well, that's smuggling in a moral law which defines what good is. Actually, I know this is going to sound a little bit odd, but if people sin and reject the salvation and they get justice for that, that's a good thing. Okay? So just because everybody isn't saved, that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. They made their choice, and they don't want Jesus. They don't want to be with God in heaven. So it's not unjust of God to punish them. And as you probably know, Cole, God isn't going to punish everybody at the same level of punishment. He's going to be just in punishment. He's not going to punish an average unbeliever at the same level of punishment as, say, Hitler. You can read Luke 12 about this. It wouldn't be right. In the afterlife, nobody's going to get a raw deal. In fact, you can look at it this way. There's only two things any of us are going to get ultimately. You're either going to get justice or you're going to get grace. Which would you rather have? I don't want justice. If I get justice, I'm toast. But if I get grace and I freely accept grace, he gets the glory for that because I didn't do anything for it. He did everything for it. But if I don't accept grace, I'm getting what I deserve. And getting what I deserve is a good thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. But then why then in your If God, Why Evil lectures do you use a utilitarian explanation to justify suffering if you think that utilitarianism ultimately fails?
Well, I'm not using a utilitarianism to justify suffering. What I'm saying is that there are goods that come out of evil that we may not see, and that's why we can trust God. I'm not saying God is playing a utilitarian game. What I'm saying is that God allows free creatures to make their own choices, and he can redeem those choices even when we can't see when or how that redemption comes, because we're in this very small window of time and we can see very little.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cole.
Now, to his point of view, when he brought up the whole robot situation, if we are not able to do what we please, then at that point we don't have free will. And the one thing that God gave us is free will. Because if he really wants to know if we love him, we have to have the ability to make that decision on our own and not be robots and be forced to love him. He doesn't force you to love him. He will push you right out. If you don't want to be with him, if you don't want to look for him, then he doesn't force you to. But he does want you to do that on your own. And if we're not able to do that on our own, then we don't have free will. Now, when it comes to the consequences of having free will, it just happens to be that with that privilege of having free will, we are pretty much able to do whatever we want. And that includes really bad actions, that includes evil actions that have consequences in the future. So God doesn't really allow evil to happen. He allows free will. Now the consequences of having free will sometimes tends to be evil actions. So that's kind of my take on it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you guys agree with that, or do you guys have a different way of looking at it? Definitely interested in finding out.